Okay, so this brings us to the question, why geoengineer? And, you know, this is really simple. I mean, there's a really simple answer to this question, and it's this familiar Keeling curve, which probably Professor Singer showed you in the last class, which is the buildup of atmospheric carbon dioxide. Now here's what I want to show you about this curve. Okay, so it starts in 1955. In 1956, there was an article in Scientific American alerting us to the problem of emitting all this carbon into the atmosphere. In 1965, President Johnson, in a message to Congress, talked about the problem of emitting carbon into the atmosphere. In the late 1960s, Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who was a White House advisor to President Nixon, wrote a series of memos in which he said, you know, if we don't do something about this, he literally says, we're going to lose Manhattan and we're going to lose Miami. This would be a good issue to get NATO involved in. Throughout the 1970s, we get a lot of science. In 1988, we get the first report of the IPCC, the international group of scientists that study this problem, which has already begun to release its latest report. In 1992, we get the Rio Earth Summit, the signing of the Framework Convention on Climate Change, ratified by every country in the world, including the United States. It talks about voluntarily reducing concentrations to 1990 levels by 2000. In 1997, we get the Kyoto Protocol, the first binding protocol. It comes into effect in 2005. In 2009, we get the Copenhagen climate meeting, right? Now, isn't this interesting? People fly around the world. They talk about climate change. They write things about climate change. They have large lecture classes at universities that talk about climate change. People worry about climate change. People make promises about climate change. They sign international agreements. All this, isn't this exciting? All this stuff goes on. But you know what? The carbon keeps increasing. Doesn't matter what people say or say they're going to do or what diplomats talk about. Carbon just keeps going up. Now, you know, you don't have to be the most pessimistic person in the world to wonder whether our usual ways of doing business through moral persuasion and politics and all that kind of stuff is actually going to get this problem under control. It looks like the problem is impervious to all these forms of human action. And that's really, it's really this observation that is driving particularly the scientific interest in geoengineering. It looks like perhaps the only solution. So Caldera and Keith write, like it or not, a climate emergency is a possibility, and geoengineering could be the only affordable and fast-acting option to avoid a global catastrophe. Okay, so that's essentially what they're talking about. But again, I want to alert you to some terms here that require some definition and understanding. What's meant by a climate emergency? Who gets to say what a climate emergency is? If you're living in the Philippines today, you probably think there's a climate emergency. In fact, the lead negotiator to the Framework Convention on Climate Change from the Philippines at the meeting, two-week meeting in Warsaw that's now underway, is on a 2-week fast because he says, you know, climate change is here. No one's paying attention. The climate emergency is sort of in the eyes of the beholder, sort of in the way that a food emergency is in the eyes of the beholder. There's if you have food, there's not really a food emergency. If you don't have food, there's a food emergency. Who gets to say? What makes one approach affordable or not? Most economists say we could actually start mitigating climate change, reducing our emissions for about 1.5 to 2% of GDP. Oh, that's a horrible amount of money. We can't spend that money. Well, if it comes to invading a country or certain kinds of entitlement programs or certain kinds of tax cuts, that's not a lot of money. When it comes to climate change, that seems unaffordable. whereas the scalpel of sulfate particles turns out to be incredibly cheap. And similarly, the idea of a global catastrophe is not a very clear notion. Now, Clive Hamilton has what he calls ethical anxieties about geoengineering. And he identifies 4 of these ethical anxieties, and I'm going to discuss them in turn. He talks about moral corruption, by which he means bad faith, that if we undertake geoengineering, or he sometimes seems to suggest even geoengineering research, this will put us on the path of moral corruption. This would be acting in bad faith. This would be duplicitous. This would involve us in self-deception. And so he writes, if we resort to climate engineering, then the efforts of ExxonMobil, for example, to subvert the truth would be rewarded, right? Because what he's saying is, geoengineering is sort of giving up on reducing emissions. And it's true that in the political debate, a lot of people say, climate change isn't happening. And if it does, we can always geoengineer, right? Because what they want to avoid is the kind of reorganization of the global economy that would occur as a result of actually getting emissions under control. So he says installing a solar filter would cement the failure of the North in its obligations to the global South. Okay? So what he's saying is, for reasons that Professor Singer talked about last time, climate change involves us in global injustices between the North and South. Guess what? Rather than acknowledging our moral debt, all we have to do is launch some space mirrors, and the world will be a happy place forevermore. And that, Hamilton thinks, is morally corrupt. Now, the important thing to see here is that what Hamilton means by moral corruption is a character flaw that is bad in itself. Moral corruption for Hamilton isn't bad because it leads us to do bad things. Moral corruption is just bad. And geoengineering, he thinks, invites moral corruption. He also thinks it's a moral hazard. Geoengineering research is virtually certain to reduce incentives to pursue emissions reductions. And he says there could not be a more vivid illustration of moral hazard than carbon capture and storage. Now, this is just a bit of a footnote that every American president, every major political leader talks about how the response to climate change has to involve carbon capture and storage. Why? Well, one reason is because just it's hard to see how we're going to get the world off of coal anytime soon. But another reason is that it's very, very bad politics to be accused of making war on coal, right? So if you want to win elections and stay in power, you'd better figure out how the coal industry is going to be part of the solution and not just simply part of the problem. So how is the coal industry part of the solution? Well, we'll build a bunch of, we'll figure out ways at a very large scale to capture the carbon that comes from burning coal. The only problem with this is I think in the world, despite tens of billions of dollars being spent on these technologies, which in principle do work, only 2 such plants have ever been constructed. So it does become a kind of rhetorical solution to climate change rather than a real one. And that's what Hamilton is talking about. Now, I think it's important to recognize that in some sense or another, moral hazard has been there from the beginning. I told you in 1965, President Johnson sent a message to Congress in which he mentioned carbon dioxide caused climate change. And this was based on a scientific report that had been written. And in that scientific report, the report talks about climate change, but it only mentions one possible solution. This is 1965. And that solution is not, getting out of your gas-guzzling automobile. And it's not getting rid of coal-fired plants. It's basically taking a bunch of white plastic material and spreading it around the oceans to reflect solar radiation. So from the very beginning, what we now call geoengineering has been in some sense and in some circles the preferred solution. William Nordhaus, a very eminent economist, in 1992, right after the agreement in Rio to reduce emissions, writes in an article in Science magazine that geoengineering would introduce a hypothetical technology that provides costless mitigation of climate change. Wow, what could be better? Costless mitigation of climate change. Well, what could be better are the actual proposals for implementing it, which include shooting smart mirrors into space with 16-inch naval rifles, or seeding the oceans with iron to accelerate carbon sequestration. So the only thing better than costless mitigation is doing it in a high-tech way that involves, using military equipment to make very large explosions, right? That's even better. And that leads actually to Hamilton's third concern, which is what he calls the lure of the technofix, right? And that's essentially what is going on here. And Hamilton says those who back geoengineering are on a slippery slope that leads them to overstate benefits and understate costs and risks. So this is kind of the consequentialist side of moral corruption. And then he thinks that on the slippery slope, technologies gather added political momentum because we live in societies predisposed to seek technological answers to social problems. Point being, we'd rather launch space mirrors than change the way that we live. Hamilton's fourth concern is that geoengineering would involve playing God. Quote, the grander schemes to regulate the climate trespass in a domain properly beyond the human. And he thinks this is a problem first because this reveals a deep fault in the human character. So we're back again to the argument or the claim that there are some things that are just bad when they're expressed in human character. But then he also thinks that playing God is bad on consequentialist grounds because our Promethean aspirations have made the world less controllable. So his point here is the more we try to control the world, the more the world seems to slip out of our control. At least for me, this resonates clearly. The more I try to control myself, the more I seem to slip out of control. So it's not hard to generalize that to the world. Okay, so Hamilton's conclusion is that geoengineering is being proposed because of our penchant for deceiving ourselves and inflating our virtues. If just global warming solutions cannot be found, who can believe in a just geoengineering regime? And then he goes on to point out that at no forum will non-human species have a voice. All of these anxieties are deepened by the creeping militarization of geoengineering and the possibility of unilateral deployment.